Get into the why. Why am I assigning this project? Well, I think that by the end, you will understand how archaeological evidence is used by archaeologists to generate conclusions about the past. So, essentially, how archaeology behaves like a science. Understand how societies in the past as well as today, like our society, succeed or fail, because you're specifically looking at why a civilization collapsed. Improve your writing skills and improve oral communication skills. Okay, so the way it's going to work is there's three parts really kind of involved. There's two separate projects on the same topic. There's a group presentation, which you're going to collaborate on, and then there's an individually written research paper on the same topic. So, group work, which you're going to evaluate each other at the end of the project, that will be 5 percentage points of your total grade, 100 percentage points. The presentation itself will be worth 5 percentage points, and your research paper will be worth 20 percentage points. Each group is going to be assigned a specific ancient civilization, and the main question you will be exploring is what are the current explanations for how this complex society collapsed, as well as the evidence. So you will not just be talking about the idea that archaeologists propose a major drought spelled the end of the old kingdom of Egypt, for example, but also what is the evidence that they are basing this on. And we'll get a little bit more into that. Let's talk about the schedule a little bit. Let me go back here. So this week you're going to meet in your groups. I'm going to give you a little more information about that. By Sunday, October 11th, one person from the group will submit an annotated bibliography, which is essentially a list of each of the sources that you found, with what each of the sources contains in terms of its pertinence to your paper. Also, a list of the different theories that you found to explain why your assigned civilization collapsed. If I need you to get different sources or find additional sources, I'll let you know. So by the end of October, if you have to, you'll upload a revised bibliography. You'll be working on your papers in October and November, and week 14. Your individually written papers will be due on December 2nd. You'll continue to work on you'll then work with your group on your presentation, and that will be due Monday of week 15. Everyone will watch these different presentations, and some of that material will be on the final quiz. Once the presentations are over, you'll also evaluate all the other members of your group, and you'll evaluate yourself for 5% of the grade. So each group is assigned an ancient civilization. You'll see that in the title. For your group, it'll say like Group 1, Aksum, which is in Ethiopia. Group 2, Old Kingdom in Egypt. Right? And so the main question that you're going to be looking at is what are the current explanations for how this complex society collapsed. Okay, so this week, what I would suggest is email your other group members, right? So start a group text going or a group email, whatever you guys want to do. But, meet your group members. On your own, I would do some preliminary research and preliminary reading, go through some of those sources on Course Reserve, do a search on Google Scholar, see if you can get some results yourself, take a few notes. Then you will meet in a group, kind of on Zoom or Blackboard Collaborate. You'll discuss the sources that you have collected, the information in those sources, start compiling an annotated bibliography. Maybe as a group, you may have to look for additional sources. and you can do that while on Zoom or Blackboard Collaborate, and then you'll submit the bibliography by Sunday. Then you'll, as individuals, read the articles, the ebooks that you've collected, and do more research on your own. All the sources that you have collected as a group, you can use for your paper. And then you can also find additional sources on your own for the paper. I have an outline on Blackboard that you can start to use to help kind of structure your paper. You can start to fill in the outline with your information. I think an outline is a really helpful way of working on the paper because you know sort of where to plug in the different information. And then with enough time before the deadline, begin writing the paper. So around week 12, I would suggest working on sort of the last drafts of the paper, and then submitting it Wednesday, December 2nd on Blackboard. Then after that, you'll be able to then work in your group again. You'll have fully researched as individuals this topic. Now what you'll do is you'll get together and start working on a presentation, like a PowerPoint presentation or a Prezi or something like that. You will create a video from your presentation. There are different ways to do this, and I'll get into some of them later on in the semester. But essentially what I do for most of the weeks, a narrated PowerPoint presentation would be good. Everyone will have that in by the beginning of week 15, the last week of class, and then everyone will get to watch every group's presentation. Okay, the questions you're looking at, and I've outlined these questions in the guide that I'm going to be posting on Blackboard. If at any point you have questions, please ask me. Also, if I'll try and explain exactly what I am talking about, right? So these questions are the same questions you're using for your paper and for your presentation. Okay. You first off want to get into a definition of collapse because the way let's say the way an engineer defines collapse is not the way an archaeologist is going to define societal collapse or social collapse. So you don't want to just get the Webster Dictionary definition of collapse because it's not going to be specific to archaeology. It would be like taking a health class and someone asking what's the difference between disease and illness. And to someone who wasn't in health sciences, they'd say, well, they're the same thing, aren't they? And actually, no, they have specific definitions, right? Disease usually is the medical side of things. Illness is the aspect of not feeling well, right? So it's the same thing with collapse. Everyone knows what collapse means in general. But we're talking specifically about ancient societies. What is collapse? So you will have Joseph Tainter, his book on Blackboard to use. He does a good job of explaining what collapse is and helping you with some of these other questions. Guy Middleton's book is on course reserve. I would suggest you take a look at that book too because he discusses collapse, and he also has examples from civilizations just like Tainter does, which you could also use for your paper and presentation. Jared Diamond wrote a book, Collapse. I don't believe we have it on course reserve as an ebook, but that's okay. You might find some of it on Google Books if you decide you want to use his definition. Joseph Tainter and Middleton also provide evidence that archaeologists use to identify a collapse. That is, that a collapse has taken place. This is different from the evidence used to explain why a collapse occurred, right? So again, to give you sort of a medical analogy, the evidence that a collapse occurred are like the symptoms that a patient has. So, you might say, this person's not feeling well. and what's wrong with them. They have an elevated heart rate. Their blood pressure is very high. They are nauseous. They are vomiting. Those are their symptoms. Right? The evidence that explains the collapse would be something like, they are dehydrated, they're suffering heat stroke, this is what is causing those symptoms. So within an archaeology framework, you're looking at the evidence that tells an archaeologist, this society collapsed around 900 AD. How do we know that? Because it was an enormous city, and we have pottery and radiocarbon dates that date to 900 AD. And then about 925 AD, the whole place is abandoned, and there's no pottery past that time. So it looks like the whole place was abandoned. That's definition of collapse. It was abandoned very quickly. There are other pieces of evidence that archaeologists use to say, yes, this society did collapse. As compared to this society declined very slowly over several hundred years. That's not a collapse. That's very different. So that's the evidence archaeologists use to identify that collapse happened. So you'll explore some of that in the paper and also the presentation. The evidence of a drought doesn't mean that a society collapsed. It means that there was a drought. It could explain why the collapse happened, and that's different. That's not evidence to identify a collapse. That's evidence used to try and explain why the collapse happened. So be very clear on these differences. If you have questions, again, you could always ask me. There may be some discounted theories that are no longer accepted. That is something you might want to mention, right? So, this civilization, back in the 1960s, archaeologists said it collapsed because there was an invasion of outside people. Today, no archaeologist accepts this anymore because the evidence doesn't support it. This would be a previous explanation or discounted theory. Some of you may not have these previous explanations. You might find, everything that's been proposed is still accepted by archaeologists and still debated. So there hasn't been anything that's really been discounted. So you won't have to use this definition then. And then the bulk of your paper, this is the meat of your paper, is current evidence and explanations for their collapse, right? Are there competing theories? Was it multiple causes or one main cause, right? So drought is something that's very commonly used to try and explain collapse. Sometimes it applies to certain civilizations, sometimes it doesn't, right? But you might say this civilization seems to have collapsed partially from drought. This is a theory to explain this collapse that archaeologists explore today. Recently, archaeologists published a paper in this journal where they had climate data that they got from glacier cores and sea cores showing that there was a sharp decrease in rainfall in the 50 years before the collapse of this civilization. Right? That kind of thing. You want to make sure you've got that hard evidence. What's the evidence that archaeologists are using to support this theory? Don't just say the theory. And then I want you to look at it, to think of it in terms of the big picture. And I've been doing this project with students in this class for probably 10 years, I think. So well before this coronavirus pandemic. But I've always wanted students to think about, okay, is there anything we can learn from ancient civilizations in terms of collapse? Some of these civilizations made big mistakes and they collapsed. Can we avoid the same problems today? So I want you to take one major problem. Since we're going through a major kind of crisis right now, you can, use coronavirus as a major problem, or you could choose something else. It's up to you. But you want to discuss, let's say, how the coronavirus could potentially cause a collapse or severe downturn of a society today. It doesn't have to be our society. It could be another country. But you kind of have to talk about how that problem could cause a collapse, right? Not just that it's causing some problems, but a collapse. And use some sort of citation to back this up as well, right? That is, you want to have, okay, New York Times recently said that the impacts from coronavirus are potentially this, this, and this. This could potentially cause a collapse in this society, right? That kind of thing. For your presentation, you'll just present on one. For your individual paper, you will decide on your own which one that you want to do individually. Okay, the format for the paper. 5 double-spaced pages of text, not including the works cited. Should be APA format. If you want to use another format, that's okay. The most important things are that you have a works cited page and internal citations. You can find out more about APA style using the APA style site, or I find this site to be very helpful. I actually learned about it from students at Grand Valley at this OWL Purdue site. There's a lot of information. Plus, I will show you how you can get the proper formatting of your references of the things that you use, so you can cut and paste them directly into your Word document. Okay, your paper has to include works cited. For every fact, you need to have an in-text citation, right? So if you take some information from a source, you have to cite that source. Even if you're not directly quoting the source, you still need to have a citation. Cover page and the abstract are not necessary. Right? The presentation is about 5 to 10 minutes in length and covers all the questions. And it's like a video like the ones that I'm presenting. Okay, so in the paper and the presentation, you should answer all of the questions that we outlined already. And I have kind of in the paper, so if this is a 5-page paper, for example, roughly about a half a page will be a definition of collapse or less. A quarter of a page will be kind of listing some of the pieces of evidence archaeologists use to identify an ancient collapse. So about a paragraph. Introduction to the civilization. Brief, right? Quarter of a page to half a page, right? So, the Old Kingdom of Egypt rose during this period. It was the period of the pyramids near 2100 BC. There was a sudden downturn in Egyptian civilization, etc. So you don't have to go too much into detail on the civilization. Then you might discuss previous theories of collapse if you have them, current theories, and the evidence. This is the meat of your paper, 3 pages, right? 2.5 to 3 pages, maybe more. Contemporary problem that could cause the collapse today, about a half a page, right? So you could say major problems in the world today, and obviously there's so many different things you can choose from. I'm going to talk a little bit about the resources that you could use, but Course Reserve linked on Blackboard, the GVSU Library Search Engine, Google Scholar, and also Google, which is somewhat helpful as I will show you. Okay, so if this was a 5-minute presentation, right, you might say, okay, if we're doing 5 minutes, 2.5 minutes is going to be on the different theories to explain collapse. Right? Okay, the best kinds of sources. Peer-reviewed articles. Right? These are scholarly articles that are sent to other people in the same field to review, and they make sure that all the I's have been dotted, but most importantly that the research is sound. So peer-reviewed journals like PLOS ONE Science, Current Anthropology, Antiquity, right? These are the kinds of journals that you're going to find connected to the library website. Books published by an academic press, University of Michigan, Cambridge, University, etc. These are the best kinds of sources. You will get lots of good information from these kinds of sources. So a lot of the books on eReserve are these kinds of books. Good sources, right? Websites such as the BBC or the New York Times. Usually they will be good places to get other sources. I will show you, but many of these articles will say, in a recent study published in the journal Science, with a hyperlink on that recent article word that you can click on and get the actual journal article that the New York Times or the BBC is writing about. But usually the BBC or New York Times article is going to be brief and it's not going to go into too much detail. Non-peer-reviewed journals or magazines, so Archaeology Magazine is a good source. You might use it to get an even better source. Acceptable sources, not to be used for everything, but maybe for just background on the civilization, right? When did the Old Kingdom start? Online encyclopedias that are reviewed by experts, right? And you will want to cite at least 5 different sources for the main part of the paper. Okay, these are things not to cite. Do not cite Wikipedia, but you can use Wikipedia. In fact, you probably will want to use Wikipedia. You will look up on Wikipedia, collapse your civilization. You can do a little reading from Wikipedia and then find all of the citations that are used and then go get those citations that are used for the Wikipedia entry, read those and use those for your paper. So Wikipedia is a good place to get other kinds of information. Do not cite blogs, right? These are, sometimes written by people who don't have the experience in the field. These things haven't been reviewed. There could be some things that are accurate in the blog mixed in with things that are inaccurate, and you will not necessarily be able to tell. Travel websites, right? These things are usually found using Google, but not Google Scholar. So yeah, I have had students who have done a Google search and taken the first 5 things that come up and basically just use those. And that doesn't necessarily work out so well. Don't use a textbook. There are better sources. A textbook is designed, for a reference in a class, but it's not really good material for a research paper. Do not cite our lecture notes or the lecture notes from another professor or university or a student paper. You can easily get a better source from eReserve, right? So don't cite, let's say, what we talked about in class within your paper. And sort of think about it the way, imagine if you were reading a research paper, this is another university student, and for a major fact, they're citing some class notes. You might think, really? Couldn't they get something else, something that was actually reviewed? Self-published books, right? So there's one particular source I don't want you to use on collapse. I think it's by Greer, Greer. The article on his website looks very professional, but when you look at it closely, you realize that he published it himself on the web. He didn't actually submit it to a journal. Right? Okay, so I'm going to show you a little bit about